Mamma had been right about Uncle Hammer. When I awoke the next morning and followed the smell of frying ham and baking biscuits into the kitchen, there he sat at the table drinking coffee with Mr. Morrison. He was unshaven and looked a bit bleary-eyed, but he was all right. I wondered if Mr. Sims looked so good. I didn't get a chance to ask, because as soon as I had said good morning, Mamma called me into her room, where a tub of hot water was waiting by the fireplace. "Hurry up," she said. "Uncle Hammer's going to take us to church." "In his car?" Mamma's brow furrowed. "Well, I just don't know. He did say something about hitching up Jack." My face faded, but then I caught the teasing glint in her eyes, and she began to laugh. "Ah, Mamma," I laughed, and splashed into the water. After my bath, I went into my room to dress. When I rejoined Mamma, she was combing her hair, which fanned her head like an enormous black halo. As I watched, she shaped the long thickness into a large chignon at the nape of her neck, and stuck 6 sturdy hairpins into it. Then, giving the chignon a pat, she reached for her pale blue cotton dress, sprinkled with tiny yellow and white flowers, and polished white buttons running from top to bottom along its front. She glanced down at me. "You didn't comb your hair." "No'm, I want you to fix me my grown-up hairdo." Mamma began buttoning the top of her dress with long, flying fingers as I slowly fastened the lower buttons. I loved to help Mamma dress. She always smelled of sunshine and soap. When the last button had slipped into place, she buckled a dark blue patent leather belt around her tiny waist and stood ready, except for her shoes. She looked very pretty. "Where's your brush?" "Right here," I said, picking up the brush from where I had laid it on the chair. Mamma sat down in Papa's rocker, and I sat on the deerskin rug in front of her. Mamma divided my hair from ear to ear into 2 sections, and braided the front section to one side, and the back section right in the center. Then she wound each braid into a flat chignon against my head. My hair was too thick and long for me to do it well myself, but Mamma could do it perfectly. I figured I looked my very best that way. When Mamma finished, I ran to the mirror, then turned, facing her with a grin. She grinned back and shook her head at my vanity. "One day, Mamma, you gonna fix my hair like yours?" "That'll be a few years yet," she answered, readjusting the cardboard lining she'd placed in her shoes to protect her feet from the dirt and gravel, which could easily seep through the large holes in the soles. She set the shoes on the floor and stepped into them. Now, with the soles facing downward and Mamma's feet in them, no one could tell what the shiny exteriors hid. Yet I felt uncomfortable for Mamma, and wished that we had enough money for her to have her shoes fixed, or better still, buy new ones. After breakfast, Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and I sat impatiently by the dying morning fire, waiting for Mamma, Big Ma, and Uncle Hammer. Uncle Hammer was dressing in the boys' room, and Mamma was with Big Ma. I checked to make sure none of them was about to appear, then leaned toward Stacy and whispered, "You think Uncle Hammer whipped Mr. Sims?" "No," said Stacy quietly. "No!" cried Little Man. You don't mean Mr. Sims whipped Uncle Hammer?" stammered an unbelieving Christopher John. "Nothing happened," said Stacy in explanation as he tugged irritably at his collar. "Nothin'?" I repeated, disappointed. "Nothin'." "How you know?" asked Little Man suspiciously. "Mamma said so. I asked her straight out this morning." "Oh," replied Little Man, resigned. "But something must have happened," I said. "I mean, Uncle Hammer and Mr. Morrison look like they haven't been to bed. How come they look like that if nothing happened?" "Mamma said Mr. Morrison talked all night to Uncle Hammer, talked him tired, and wouldn't let him go up to the Simses." "Aw, shoot!" I exclaimed, my dream of revenge against the Simses vanishing as Stacy talked. I propped my elbows on my knees, then settled my head in my upraised hands, and stared into the glowing embers. A burning knot formed in my throat, and I felt as if my body was not large enough to hold the frustration I felt, nor deep enough to drown the rising anger. "It ain't fair," Christopher John sympathized, patting me lightly on with his pudgy hand. "Sho ain't," agreed Little Man. "Cassie," Stacy said softly. At first I didn't look at him, thinking he would go ahead and say what he had to say. But when he didn't, I turned toward him. He leaned forward secretively, and automatically Christopher John and Little Man did the same. "Y'all better be glad nothing happened," he said in a whisper, "'cause I heard Big Ma tell Mamma last night that if Mr. Morrison didn't stop Uncle Hammer might get killed." "Killed?" we echoed as the fire sputtered and died. "Who'd do that?" I cried. "Not one of them puny Simses." Stacy started to speak, but then Mamma and Big Ma entered, and he cautioned us into silence. When Uncle Hammer joined us, freshly shaven and in another suit, the boys and I put on our coats and headed for the door. Uncle Hammer stopped us. "Stacy, that the only coat you got, son?" he asked. Stacy looked down at his faded cotton jacket. Everyone else did, too. The jacket was too small for him, that was obvious, and compared to Little Man's and Christopher John's and mine, it was admittedly in sadder shape. Yet we were all surprised that Uncle Hammer would ask about it, for he knew as well as anyone that Mamma had to buy our clothes in shifts, which meant we each had to wait our turn for new clothes. Stacy looked up at Mamma, then back at Uncle Hammer. Yes, sir," he answered. Uncle Hammer stared at him, then waving his hand ordered, "Take it off." Before Stacy could question why, Uncle Hammer disappeared into the boys' room. Again Stacy looked at Mama. "You better do like he says," she said. Uncle Hammer returned with a long box, store-wrapped in shiny red Christmas paper and a fancy green ribbon. He handed the package to Stacy. "It was supposed to be your Christmas present, but I think I better give it to you now. It's cold out there." Gingerly, Stacy took the box and opened it. "A coat!" cried Little Man joyously, clapping his hands. "Wool," Mama said reverently. "Go ahead, Stacy, try it on." Stacy eagerly slipped on the coat. It was much too big for him, but Mama said that she could take up the sleeves and that he would grow into it in another year. Stacy beamed down at the coat, then up at Uncle Hammer. A year ago he would have shot into Uncle Hammer's arms and hugged his thanks, but now at the manly age of 12 he held out his hand, and Uncle Hammer shook it. "Come on, we better go," said Mama. The morning was gray as we stepped outside, but the rain had stopped. We followed the path of bedded rocks that led to the barn, careful not to slip into the mud, and got into the Packard, shining clean and bright from the washing Uncle Hammer and Mr. Morrison had given it after breakfast. Inside the Packard, the world was a wine-colored luxury. The boys and I, in the back, ran our hands over the rich felt seats, tenderly fingered the fancy door handles and window knobs, and peered down amazed at the plush carpet peeping out on either side of the rubber mats. Mr. Morrison, who was not a church-going man, waved good-bye from the barn, and we sped away. As we drove onto the school grounds and parked, the people milling in front of the church turned, stared at the Packard. Then Uncle Hammer stepped from the car, and someone cried, "Well, I'll be doggone! It's our Hammer! Hammer Logan!" And in the body, the crowd engulfed us. TJ ran up with Mo Turner and little Willie Wiggins to admire the car. "It's Uncle Hammer's," Stacy said proudly. But before the boys could sufficiently admire the car, Mama and Big Ma shooed us toward the church for the service. It was then that TJ noticed Stacy's new coat. "Uncle Hammer gave it to him," I said. "Ain't it something?" TJ ran his long fingers over the lapels and shrugged. "It's all right, I guess, if you like that sort of thing." "All right!" I cried, indignant at his casual reaction to the coat. "Boy, that's the finest coat you ever did lay eyes on, and you know it." TJ sighed. "Like I said, it's all right, if you lookin' like a fat preacher." Then he and little Willie and Mo laughed and went on ahead. Stacy looked down at the coat, with its long sleeves and wide shoulders. His smile faded. "He don't know what he's talking about," I said. "He's just jealous, that's all." "I know it," snapped Stacy sourly. As we slid into the pew in front of TJ whispered, "Here comes the preacher," then leaned forward and said snidely, "How you do, Reverend Logan?" Stacy turned on TJ, but I poked him hard. "Mama's looking," I whispered, and he turned back around. After church, as TJ and the others looked longingly at the car, Mama said, "Stacy, maybe TJ wants to ride." Before Stacy could reply, I spoke up hurriedly. "No, ma'am, Mama, he got something else he got to do." Then under my breath, so that I would not be guilty of a lie, I added, "He got to walk home like he always do." "That'll teach him," whispered Little Man. "Yeah," agreed Christopher John, but Stacy sulked by the window and said nothing. The sun was out now, and Uncle Hammer suggested that we take a real ride before going home. He drove us the full 22 miles up to Strawberry by the way of the Jackson Road, one of the 2 roads leading to the town. But Mama and Big Ma objected so much to going through Strawberry that he turned the big old car around and headed back towards home, taking the old Soldiers' Road. Supposedly, rebel soldiers had once marched up the road and across Soldiers' Bridge to keep the town from falling into the hands of the Yankee army, but I had my doubts about that. After all, who in his right mind would want to capture Strawberry, or defend it either for that matter? The road was hilly and curving, and as we sped over it, scattered road stones hit sharply against the car's underbelly, and the dust swelled up in rolls of billowing clouds behind us. Little Man, Christopher John, and I shrieked with delight each time the car climbed a hill and dropped suddenly downward, fluttering our stomachs. Eventually, the road intersected with the Jefferson Davis School Road. Uncle Hammer stopped the car at the intersection, and, leaning his right arm heavily over the steering wheel, motioned languidly at the Wallace store. "Got me a good mind to burn that place out," he said. "Hammer, hush that kind of talk," ordered Big Ma, her eyes growing wide. "Me and John Henry and David grew up together, and John Henry and me even fought in the war together. What good was it? A black man's life ain't worth the life of a cowfly down here." "I know that, son, but that kind of talk gets you hung, and you know it." Mama touched Uncle Hammer's arm. "There might be another way, Hammer, like I told you. Now don't go do something foolish. Wait for David. Talk to him." Uncle Hammer looked glassy-eyed at the store, then sighed, and eased the Packard across the road toward Soldiers' Bridge. We were taking the long way home. Soldiers' Bridge was built before the Civil War. It was spindly and wooden, and each time I had to cross it I held my breath until I was safely on the other side. Only one vehicle could cross at a time, and whoever was on the bridge first was supposed to have the right-of-way, although it didn't always work that way. More than once, when I had been in the wagon with Mama or Big Ma, we had to back off the bridge when a white family started across after we were already on it. As the bridge came into view, the other side of the river was clearly visible, and it was obvious to everyone that the old Model T truck, overflowing with red-headed children, had reached the bridge first and was about to cross. But suddenly Uncle Hammer gassed the Packard and sped on to the creaking structure. The driver of the truck stopped, and for no more than a second hesitated on the bridge. Then, without a single honk of protest, backed off so that we could pass. "Hammer!" Big Ma cried. "They think you're Mr. Granger." "Well, now, won't they be surprised when we reach the other side?" said Uncle Hammer. As we came off the bridge, we could see the Wallaces, all three of them, Dewberry, Thurston, and Caleb, touching their hats respectfully, then immediately freeze as they saw who we were. Uncle Hammer, straight-faced and totally calm, touched the brim of his own hat in polite response, and without a backward glance sped away, leaving the Wallaces gaping silently after us. Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and I laughed, but Mama's cold glance made us stop. "You shouldn't have done that, Hammer," she said quietly. "The opportunity, dear sister, was too much to resist. But one day we'll have to pay for it. Believe me," she said. "One day we'll pay."